All right, so basically, the agenda for today's final tutorial is this is going to be our last tutorial of the semester. We're going to look at data preparation and machine learning. Generally, code for this section is not tested on your exams. However, this will help you with the last deliverable of your project and maybe with your recent homework as well. So anyway, let's get started. First of all, we have normalization. So first we're going to look at how you should prepare your data, which involves normalization, standardization, and encoding any variables or any columns that you need to before passing it on to your model. So normalization is also called feature scaling. We use a very simple formula to normalize every point. You take the minimum value of that particular column and its maximum value. So it's x minus min minus max minus min. Essentially, it distributes your data in such a way कि आपकी सारी values between 0 and 1 आ जाती हैं, where 1 represents the maximum value and 0 represents the minimum value. So suppose if I had a column salary and the minimum salary of an employee in my data set was 20,000 rupees and the maximum was 2 lakh rupees. So in that case 2 lakh के corresponding जो normalized value आएगी वो 1.0 होगी and the corresponding value to 20,000 will be 0.0. Before we identify the issue with normalization, let's try and see how we'll do this in code. Actually, one more very important thing. Why is it so important to normalize your features before passing it to your machine learning model? So this is very important because if you have two or three numerical features, even let's suppose I have age and then in another column I have salaries. So age की typically range would be maybe 2030 से लेके 80ish, right? At best. However, salaries could range from 20-30K up until well very large numbers. So when I pass this to my model, so gin features का scale is generally bigger than the others, those features will dominate at the end of the day, and we don't want that to happen. That is why we do normalization in order to ensure कि आपके सारे features same scale पे हैं before you pass these to the model. So let's look at a simple problem. I have generated my data over here and well, not even generated, I've just declared my data. And you have age and you have income, the same example basically. So intuitively, we can do this very easily as well because technically, आपने बस min and max लेना है. And so I have taken the minimum age, the maximum age, the minimum income, and the maximum income. And now I'm going to introduce two new rows in my data frame, scaled age and scaled income. Alternatively, मैं इन्हें same columns में भी store कर सकती थी if I wanted. All right, so df age minus min age divided by max minus min. So that's very simple. And this is what it gives you. So we can very clearly even see कि जो minimum और maximum values हैं वो 0 और 1 को ही correspond कर रही हैं. And all right, okay, let's look at the same example now through a more complex data set. And essentially, instead of doing this thing manually, we're going to use a function to do this instead. And that function is the min-max scaler, which is available in the sklearn library ka pre-processing module. All right, and actually, this is what you would generally use as well. You wouldn't want to do this kind of thing manually anyway. So this is the data set that we will be working with. We have seen this data set in our prior tutorials as well. The life expectancy data, जिसमें you have several columns and well, you have 21 columns and let me just check के yeah, you have 2,983 rows. All right. And इस data set के अंदर I'm taking the life expectancy column just to show you. Where is the, yeah, it's right over here. All right. So life expectancy 65, 59, and well, so on and so forth. Maybe I can quickly just copy this from here. Let's try to look at the distribution of this as well. Acha, definitely the wrong plot. So this is what the distribution of life expectancy column looks like. And we're going to perform normalization on this using your min-max scaler, which just corresponds to min-max scaling, which is another term used for normalization. All right, so I take the values. Dot value से सिर्फ ये होता है कि why don't I just quickly show you guys as well. See, it gives you an array. If I remove this dot values, then it will give me a pandas series, and I don't want a series right now. All right, so I'm gonna take these values and then I have to initialize my scalar. So scalar equals min max scalar. This is exactly what we imported. And then you have a simple function scalar ka, which is dot fit transform. And then I am just passing basically my life expectancy की जो series है along with that, and I'm passing those values. So let's see what it gives you. See, now all my values are within a range of 0 and 1. I haven't actually stored this anywhere, or yeah, I actually have stored it in the same column. And if you look at the entire data frame, this is what that column looks like now. And of course, it's important to keep in mind that this is not the only column in our data frame. You have the status, which is a categorical variable. You have in the year, which is a numerical variable, and then you have several other numerical and categorical variables. So you have to deal with each separately. If you have an uninformative feature, for instance, आप car prices determine कर रहे हैं and you've collected data, and that data includes the names of the owners of certain cars as well at the time of purchase. And intuitively, it feels like a feature that should have no impact on the worth of a car. So maybe that I can simply drop. So you remove the uninformative features, you scale the numerical features, and then you encode the categorical features. We're going to look at each of these three. Are there any questions up until this point?
No.
All right. So let's move on to standardization. And at this point, I'm going to ask you guys if anyone can tell me what is the one big problem that we can identify with normalization. Like standardization भी आपके पास एक normalization की ही technique है. But what is the problem with normalization?
Couldn't it be that with new data you will have to normalize it every time?
Well, technically, you would have to do that with standardization as well, no? Because actually, let me tell you what. So, standardization takes the mean. It's also called z-score normalization, by the way. So, you take the mean and you take the standard deviation, and then her point को आप इस तरह calculate करते हैं that it's that point minus the mean divided by the standard deviation. So the problem with normalization is that it is very sensitive to outliers. जो हमने पिछली examples देखी, they were relatively straightforward. But suppose that this is the data that I have, all right, and then out of nowhere I have this. It's probably just an error when entering data, right? लेकिन इस error से होगा ये कि जब मैं normalized values compute करूंगी, तो सबसे पहले तो 900 को वैल्यू मिल जाएगी 1.0 की, and all the values are going to be since distributed according to the minimum and the maximum value only. So maybe this is what the rest of my values could look like. I hope that makes sense. So ये very important चीज है. Standardization is a kind of normalization that is not sensitive to outliers, since it relies on the mean and standard deviation instead of relying on just the minimum and the maximum values, which are extreme values. And essentially, standardization will distribute your data in such a way that the resulting values, unka jab aap mean lenge, it will always be 0 and the standard deviation will always be 1. All right, with that, let's look at. Yeah, did I cut off a question?
Yeah. I wanted to ask if standard normalization is better than the normal min max normalization that we were doing. Is there any benefit to doing it in the first place, like the min max one, in compared to standard normalization?
I am going to be candid with you. I've never ever thought of it that way. Let me actually definitely look into that and maybe we can circle back to this then. लेकिन I don't think कि कोई खास advantage है by the way which normalization offers to you over standardization. I want to say simplicity, but this is quite simple as well. It's probably just one came after the other. Make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, let's move on then. So I'm going to use my same data frame and intuitively मैं इसको बगैर scalar import किए भी कर सकती हूँ because I just have to calculate the mean and the standard deviation. And we already know that you can very easily do that in pandas just like that. And then I calculate the normalized age and the normalized income by just applying this formula. And this is the distribution that I get. Can someone tell me what does a negative z score represent? यानी ये जो normalized score आया है after standardization, if it is negative, what does that mean? All right, interesting. So a negative z score means that the original value was below the mean, and अगर इसकी value 0 हो तो it corresponds to well the mean, and if the value is greater than 0, it means that this was above the mean. With that, let's move on. So now again I have sklearn library के pre-processing module के अंदर standard scalar as opposed to the min-max scalar, and that's the only thing that changes interestingly. See again, I take the values and when I initialize my scalar, I initialize it to standard scalar instead of min-max scalar. And now I have my same fit transform function and there we go. All right, so इसको ऐसे भी देख लेते हैं. Are there any questions at this point, or shall we move on to ML? All right, let's move on then. So we're going to look at linear regression, well, simple and multiple linear regression. Then we're going to look at logistic regression, then some matrix, and well, that's it actually. All right, I've imported a bunch of things over here. इसमें कोई भी चीज concerning नहीं होनी चाहिए. Essentially, you can do this using, well, I'm going to show you two different libraries, and I think you should be comfortable with both as data scientists. So we have sklearn, and I think Dr. Mubin uses sklearn in her sessions as well. And then you also have stats models, which is also very simple. All right. So first we're going to look at sklearn. Sklearn may you have several modules available. Pre-processing we already looked at. Here you have model selection. Here libraries के modules के अंदर you have several functions available that you have to import. So for instance, sklearn का एक module है pre-processing जिसके अंदर एक function है standard scalar, and उसी के अंदर we have a function min max scalar. So you import that as well. Model selection may you have a function train test split, which randomly just splits your data into training and test sets. And then linear model के module के अंदर you have linear regression, you also have logistic regression. Logistic regression linear model में नहीं है, we'll look at that. And then sklearn.matrix के अंदर you have MSC, MAE, R2 score, and several other metrics available. Right now, we're just going to be using these two. All right. So with that, let's look at the data set that I have created over here. And this is what you have. Chota sa data set hai. There are just 30 values over here. All right. You have the midterm marks, the final marks, and then the overall performance of a student. All right. And overall is not just mid plus final because usme there are a bunch of other components which I haven't recorded in my data set. Eventually, of course, it must be the sum of everything. But our problem is we're trying to determine कि आप एक student की overall performance को estimate कर सकते हैं क्या using the midterm and slash or the final marks of that given student. All right, let's look at the correlation between these variables. So whenever you're actually applying a model, intuitively you have to follow a certain series of steps. It doesn't start with normalization or with standardization. It always starts with exploring your data. And then you go back and forth between exploring your data and visualizing your data. And then you determine कि आपने कौन से features use करने हैं, and a lot of that is hit and trial as well. Then you scale the features and then you encode the features and then you move on to your model, and then you can experiment with multiple models. So anyway, that is just to show you the intuition behind this. And I can see कि final and mid के बीच में the correlation coefficient is already 0.88, and mid and overall ke beech mein the correlation coefficient is 0.94. Well, generally we can see that the correlations are high between these. Anyway, with that I have made a few plots as well. So we're going to plot PLT को use करके mid versus overall marks. Oh, and very easily we can observe a positive correlation, a fairly strong positive correlation, in fact. Similarly, final versus overall marks, which also gives us a fairly strong correlation. So technically, you should be able to use these features to predict the overall marks. They must give you some information. With that, I would also like to mention that even if you see no visible trend over here or over here, that still does not mean कि आप इन features को use करके overall marks को नहीं predict कर सकते. Because maybe that just means that a single feature isn't correlated with overall, but maybe a combination of those features is correlated with overall. Now, the combination could be linear or it could be polynomial. Are there any questions at this point? All right, with that, let's move on. So now we're going to model our data. Acha, I would also like to mention that if your relationship is linear, then your linear regression model will suffice. If it is not linear, तो आप linear equation पे नहीं map कर सकते, then you're going to have to form a polynomial equation. All right, anyway. So now I have my features and my target. That is the first step. You're going to define X and you're going to define Y, and it's very straightforward. क्योंकि literally मैंने अपने data frame में से mid और final का एक sub data frame निकाला. I used the values of that data frame and then I did the same but for overall instead. So let's see what X and Y look like as well. Alright, so this is X, बस उसने मुझे tuple format में सारा कुछ दे दिया. And Y is giving me exactly the corresponding values of the overall column. And everything is in array format. Step 2, you're going to split your data now into training and testing data sets. Alright, so इसके लिए we're going to use sklearn का function train test split. Train test split में आपके पास 4 parameters जाते हैं. You have X, which represents your features, Y, which represents the target variable, then the test size, which is a ratio. So zero point 0.2 means कि 20% data को randomly test में डाल दो. I can simply like change this to 0.8 as well, but that would be a very bad proportion because then I have only 20% data available for training. And then random state as well, that's just a seed that will allow me to replicate this. I could change it as well. All right. And it gives me 4 things in the output. in this exact order. So it gives me X train, X test, which means training features, testing features. Y train is training की जो आपकी actual ground truths है, and then Y test will give me the ground truths for testing. Now, even logically, when I'm training, I'm going to use X-train and X-test both. Sorry, my bad. I'm going to use X-train and Y-train both. And when I'm testing, I'm just going to use X-test. And then when I'm evaluating the performance of my model, so here I'm going to use Y-test as well. All right, with that, I have split my data. We can see what this looks like as well. So this is what I have in X-train. Essentially, बिल्कुल उसी तरह की array है, but randomly, it just has 80% of my data now. Step 3. Now we're going to want to prepare our data. Actually, step 2 and 3 can be interchanged as well. इस example में, I don't know why I've done scaling later and splitting पहले. But आगे logistic regression वाली example में we're gonna scale the data first and split it at the end. Because of course you would want to prepare it before sending it, right? So anyway, I've just imported my standard scaler and मैंने standardization की है for X train as well as X test. So this is one very important thing to also be mindful of कि आप जो मर्जी मॉडल यूज कर रहे हैं whatever kind of feature scaling normalization standardization encoding you have done for आपका जो training वाला set है you have to do those exact same things for testing as well unless you do it first and then split it. All right. So with that, I have transformed my data. Step 4, now you will define your model. We're going to use multiple linear regression over here. Can someone tell me the difference between simple linear regression and multiple linear regression? All right, that's interesting. So simple linear regression में you have one predicting variable, one predictor जो आपकी x की value है. For instance, मैं mid के scores को use करके overall performance determine करूँ. So that's simple linear regression. Multiple linear regression में you have multiple features that you are using to predict a target value. For instance, using both mid and final scores to calculate the overall performance, which I'm doing in this case, by the way. ये मैंने तभी डिसाइड कर लिया था जब यहाँ पे मैंने डेटा डिफाइन किया. All right. So anyway, so in sklearn, by default, you're using ordinary least squares. So I've defined the model. Let me just quickly see कि ये आपको well, so it's the linear regression model. Okay, then step 5, now that you have defined your model, you want to train your model. And it's such a simple series of commands that follows. Okay, now you just have model.fit. Model.fit को दो parameters pass होते हैं, the training features and the training ground truths. Alright, so X train and Y train. X train में आपके पास training set के mid and final के marks जा रहे हैं, and then Y train के अंदर you have just like उन्हीं के corresponding overall performance. And that's what you're using to train your data. Okay. Step 6. Now that you have trained your model, you want to make predictions. So for that you have a very simple command model.predict. Predict को सिर्फ एक ही चीज पास होती है and that is the features of the test set. So X test. I am not passing a Y test over here because Y test is the ground truth and now I'm just predicting and in fact ये मुझे return करेगा predictions की list and then I will compare that to ground truths की list which is Y test and that is what I will use to evaluate the performance of my model. So let's see कि y predicted में हमारे पास आता भी क्या है. So these are the predicted values that we have gotten. I will use these with whatever metric that I'm using to evaluate how well my model has performed. So the last step, step 7, is evaluation. Now I'm using sklearn.matrix के functions mean squared error and R2 score. All right, both of which take two parameters, y test and y predictions, the ground truths and your predictions. And these are the results that I have obtained. Fairly decent results, but also a fairly simple problem and very little data. Are there any questions at this point? All right, so let's look at some of these things using stats models as well. I'm going to try and go through this relatively quickly. So आपके पास stats models की library है, उसके modules में you have formula and then, well, you can ignore .api. Interestingly, I'm still going to use sklearn for splitting as well as for my evaluation matrix. I'm using the exact same data, and now I'm going to do a split first. So I've used the same function train test split, and you will see कि अब इस function को मैंने अपना data frame pass किया है. Instead of passing, well, simply last time I passed x values and y values, आप इसको पूरा data frame भी pass कर सकते हैं, and ये आपको दो data frames return करेगा. Just like that. So these are two entire data frames. They have been divided in such a way that 60% of my data is in the training set. Next, I'm preparing my train and test data. So, यहाँ पे you have something slightly different. I have to manually, SM is short for stats models, just like PD is short for pandas. So you have dot add constant and ये आपको manually खुद ही डालना पड़ता है. And this is just the intercept for linear regression. And sklearn, which I generally also would prefer, will just do this for you automatically. All right, now I'm going to define my model as well as, well, I've already called fit, so I'm fitting my data to the model as well. And then, so you have smf.ols. OLS means ordinary least squares regression. इसके formula में I specify, basically it has to be in this format. When I specify overall and then final, it means के overall represents the thing that I'm trying to predict, and final represents the predictor or the feature that I'm using for prediction. And then you specify data के अंदर train data, which includes my my predictors, my features, as well as my target variable. All right, and then I'm going to use my simple model to predict on my test data. And you would think कि अब आपने train data के साथ x, y की value specify नहीं की, but that's the interesting thing. When you gave it in the formula, it's going to look for those corresponding columns within your train data frame. All right, so you select predict. You can print a summary of the model. It gives you, well, R squared, adjusted R squared, F statistic. Even I don't know what the F statistic is, and well, lots of other stuff. Okay. And then, of course, the last step is that we evaluate. So evaluation के लिए, again, I just have y test and y predicted. So I have my predictions and I have my ground truths, and उन्हें मैंने pass किया है mean squared error के अंदर. If I'm not wrong, तो इनका order switched होना चाहिए. You know what? I'll look into it and update it before releasing this notebook. Anyway, so that was an example of simple linear regression. In this case, we just did simple linear regression. And why are we calling this simple linear regression? Because when we gave the formula for regression, तो उसमें we specified कि आपने overall performance predict करनी है using just the score of the final. So you have just one feature that you're using to predict the value of your target variable. All right, so that's simple linear regression. Now we're gonna try and do the same for ये ठीक था. I think this was fine. All right, anyway. Let's move on. Let's do multiple linear regression. And just this is the only thing that changes. My formula changes. पहले यहाँ पे I had final, now I had mid plus final. So it will go into my data frame, train data, and it will look for mid and final wale columns, and it will combine those two to make my features, and it will look for the overall column, and it will turn that into my target variable. All right. and everything else essentially remains pretty much the same. Now I can see okay, here my r squared is 0.990 and here it is 0.974. Does this mean that multiple linear regression will always give you better results than simple linear regression? Can someone answer that?
Couldn't it overfit as well? Because
Yeah, it could. It could.
isn't it possible that the results are specifically better for the training data and not actual the test data?
Oh no no no, हम जो results देख रहे हैं वो हम test data पे देख रहे हैं. We're not looking at the training data
Like,
results. See? So testing data model ने पहले नहीं देखा हुआ. I hope you got it right.
yeah, yeah, I got it.
Okay, all right. So can I still say कि multiple linear regression in general is always going to outperform simple linear regression because you have more features available? No, you cannot say that because it really depends on the usefulness of your features. And हमने module 3 में भी देखा था where you were using multivariate regression to control for confounding variables. We saw that just by increasing the number of variables, you don't always improve performance. The same thing follows for regression and for ML as well in general. So more features does not always mean better results. If they're useless features तो वो आपकी performance को negatively भी impact कर सकते हैं. All right. On that note, are there any questions before we move on to logistic regression? All right, with that, moving on to logistic regression. And now I've imported a bunch of other stuff. So let's see what's different. And we're reverting back to sklearn as well. So abhi sklearn.preprocessing may say again, I just have my standard scaler. Then I have logistic regression wala model. I have train test split, and then matrix may I have imported a bunch of stuff which I'm going to use for classification. Previously I imported mean squared error and R2 score, and this time I've imported confusion matrix, classification report, accuracy score, precision, recall, and F1. Technically मुझे इन तीनों की जरूरत नहीं थी. I'll get to why. Then I have seaborn and matplotlib and well a display for the confusion matrix which we'll get to. Can someone tell me the difference between logistic regression and linear regression? बहुत recently पढ़ी हुई चीज है. Why do we need logistic regression? Or what do we use it for? All right, anyway, so logistic regression is something you use for classification. And simple regression के जो हमने अभी models देखे, you were using those basically to predict numerical values. Now we want to predict categories, whether a given cancer is, sorry, a tumor is benign or is it malignant, is it cancerous? That's one example of a classification problem. Whether the person in an image is happy or sad or angry, that's a multi-class classification problem. Multi-classification problem actually. ये थोड़ी सी distinct चीजें होती हैं. Anyway, so for classification, we use logistic regression. Even logistic regression generally fails जब आपके पास बहुत ज़्यादा classes available हो. For instance, using some data that is available to me, I can determine whether a person is likely to be a heart patient or not. It's a simple yes or no classification question. Logistic regression might work really well on this problem. But if I have like tens of categories, the logistic regression will fail as well. We actually, I think that is out of the scope of this course, so I'm not gonna go there either. Let's look at our model now. Let's look at our data. This time, instead of just defining data, I am generating data. All right, and let's see how we are doing that. अब तक तो हमने बहुत data generating algorithms देख लिए हैं. This is a relatively simple one. I have the number of samples. C is for, well, replication. And anyway, so before anything else, I just want to show you what my data looks like as well. I have these columns. I have the age of a person, the gender of a person, their highest level of education, their marital status, and purchased or not. So I have customer data. Whatever product it was that I'm selling, I'm trying to determine basically कि एक पर्सन का अगर मुझे ये वाला डेटा गिवन हो, if I know their age and their gender and their education and their marital status, can I predict whether they are likely to have purchased a given product or not? We don't know what product we're concerned with, but this is the problem. कि आप देख रहे हैं कि by knowing a few features of a customer, can you determine whether they are likely to purchase a product or not? All right, and now let's see how I'm generating that data. I've written all unique values in an array. Gender ke liye I have male, female, and I have other. Then education ke liye I have high school, bachelor's, master's, and PhD. Marital status may you have single, married, and divorced. And this is how I'm generating my data. So I'm generating a random number between 18 and 65, and I'm generating 100 such random numbers for my age column. Then for gender, this is what I'm doing. Acha, here I've given one value 100. Actual में I called it for 500 for this case. All right, so उतनी ये values produce करता है. Then for gender, you randomly choose from the three genders available times the number of samples. The same thing you do for education, but education ke liye I've given probabilities. So there is a 25% chance of selecting high school. There is a 35% chance of selecting bachelor's, a 25% chance of selecting master's, and a 15% chance of selecting PhD. So ये आपने probabilities की array दी हुई है. When I didn't give this array over here for gender, it meant that there was a 33.3% chance of selecting any of these. All right, okay. And then you create a data frame. And in that data frame, up one value is missing, the target value, which is the likelihood of them purchasing an item. इसको हम इस तरह systematically calculate कर रहे हैं कि let's just parse through this. It's very easy. Score equals 0. So if row education, so if a person has a master's or a PhD, so you add 1 to that score. All right. If the age is greater than 40, you add 1 to that score. If the marital status is married, you add 1 to that score. And if the gender is female, you add 1 to that score. And then I check if the score is greater than or equal to 0, I will return 1. Sorry, greater than or equal to 2, I will return 1, which means the person is likely to purchase this item. Otherwise, I will return 0. And so I'm just applying this function, which gives me a data frame like this. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, moving on. So अब हमने data तो generate कर लिया है. Now we're going to model this data, and what I'm trying to predict is purchased. And even though it feels like a numerical value, it's actually not. ये yes no वाली values हैं. This is a classification problem. I'm trying to predict whether a person will purchase this item or they will not. All right, and I've just mapped those onto zeros and ones. अगर मैं इसको as a regression problem ही treat करूंगी, simple regression model लगा दूं or something, तो my outputs would look like this: 0.3, 1.2, and just basically discrete numbers. Sorry, continuous numbers, and we're not looking for that. So anyway, when you're modeling your data, the first step is that you define your features, you're predicting variables, and you define the target. And अभी ये define करने के मेरे पास दो तरीके थे x को. Either I could have done this and then I would have specified a list of all the columns that I want to take. Alternatively, I just did this. I dropped the purchased column. एक्सेस मैंने वन स्पेसिफाई किया बिकॉज दैट मीन्स कि वो वाला कॉलम जाके ड्रॉप कर दो. इफ आई don't specify the axis, it will look for the purchased label amongst my rows. And then y के लिए obviously I've selected purchased. So this is what x looks like. See, and there are 500 values. And this is what y looks like. It's a series and x was a data frame. All right, step 2. And यहाँ पे step 2 is very important for us because we have different types of variables and we're going to encode them. So step 2 is encoding and scaling. In simple words, you can say preparing your data for the model. All right, because the thing is कि ये data as it is मैं किसी भी model को नहीं दे सकती अभी. So let's see. We're beginning by, actually, I should have began here. I think this is the most straightforward thing to begin with. I normalize age, and we know how to do that. I'm doing standardization or z-score normalization over here by initializing the standard scalar, and then standard scalar ka function है fit transform, which will transform my age. And this is what age looks like now. All right. Let's see what we're going to do next. Actually, I'm just gonna come back over here and you have gender, you have education and you have marital status. ये तीनों कैटेगोरिकल वैल्यूज हैं लेकिन इन तीनों पे एक encoding scheme नहीं लग सकती. So you have one hot encoding and then you have, well, ordinal encoding. So I'm just going to start with gender and I'm going to ask you people to think about it and tell me कि gender के ऊपर should we do one hot encoding or can we do ordinal encoding? If either of which, then why?
I believe ordinal encoding because there's three options for gender.
Mm-hmm, okay. And what is ordinal encoding basically? Like, what does the word ordinal tell you?
That we can like choose our own sets of values for each category.
No, no, and it's wonderful कि ये चीज raise हो गई. Because let me tell you what ordinal is defined from the word order. And gender में male, female या other का कोई order नहीं है. Like one doesn't have precedence over the other in any way whatsoever, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so in this case, ordinal encoding doesn't work actually. Ordinal encoding works जब categories का एक certain order हो. For instance, I had colors red, blue, yellow, green. So do you think ordinal encoding would work for colors?
Not unless हम कोई बहुत ही specific चीज पे उनको order
Yeah,
करने लगे.
exactly. Like for instance, आपके पास traffic lights में colors हैं, तो maybe red, yellow, green को आप ordinal कह सकते हैं कि ये एक order में आते हैं. One has precedence over the other. लेकिन if you just have random colors, or for instance, if you had colors in a rainbow, that would still work. लेकिन if you just have a bunch of random favorite colors that people have put in, तो फिर आप ordinal encoding नहीं कर सकते because उनका कोई order नहीं है. Make sense?
Yes.
एंड जब ऑर्डर नहीं होता तो आपको वन हॉट एन्कोडिंग करनी पड़ती है बिकॉज अगर फॉर इंस्टेंस लेट मी टेल यू द प्रॉब्लम विद कोडिंग दिस इन अ सिंपल ऑर्डिनल मैनर. अगर मैं सिंपल ऑर्डिनल कोडिंग करूं तो मेल को जैसे वन असाइन कर दूं, फीमेल को टू असाइन कर दूं एंड अदर को थ्री असाइन कर दूं, तो मेरा जो मॉडल है उसको लगेगा कि somehow other is bigger than male or female, like I'm giving it a bigger value. उसको लगेगा कि ये जो जेंडर कॉलम में अगर किसी की वैल्यू थ्री है तो उसको ज्यादा वेट मिल रहा है, अगर किसी की वैल्यू वन है तो उसे कम वेट मिल रहा है. आई एम काइंड ऑफ टेलिंग माई मॉडल कि ये अब सीक्वेंस में चीजें आ गई हैं. ऑब्वियसली थ्री इज बिगर देन वन एंड देन योर मॉडल्स आर जस्ट अबाउट नंबर्स. मेक सेंस?
Yes.
Wonderful. So इसीलिए we're going to do one hot encoding. And how does one hot encoding work? इसको भी हम देख लेते हैं. Actually, for simplicity, you know what I should have done? I should remove other from here. ठीक है, मेल और फीमेल. I'm just going to keep two columns over here. या अभी इसको थ्री ही रखते हैं. I will get to it. वो फिर बाइनरी encoding के साथ mix up हो जाता है. Anyway, so if I have my data that looks like this, male, female, other. फीमेल, ऑलराइट। और मैं इसको इंकोड करूं तो इंकोडेड वैल्यूज जो हैं दे वुड लुक समथिंग लाइक दिस, 1 0 0, ऑलराइट। फॉर इंस्टेंस दैट्स फॉर मेल, for female I would have 0 1 0. For other I could have then, okay, I could nahi, I would have 2 0 0 1, and then again I have female, so that would be 0 1 0. Does this encoding make sense? Essentially आपकी जो वन हॉट encoding है वो होती exactly इसी तरह से है। अब हुआ क्या, मेरे पास 3 बिट्स थी corresponding to the 3 values, ऑलराइट। ये एक्चुअली फिर 3 डिफरेंट कॉलम्स में भी जा सकता है, जनरली 3 डिफरेंट कॉलम्स में ही जाते हैं इनफैक्ट, ऑलराइट। एंड एज अ रिजल्ट कुछ ऐसे होगा कि ये 3 कॉलम्स बन जाएंगे डेटा फ्रेम में, जेंडर मेल, जेंडर अंडरस्कोर फीमेल एंड जेंडर अंडरस्कोर अदर। और फिर मेरा डेटा इस तरह हो जाएगा कि अगर पहली वैल्यू मेल की थी तो ये फर्स्ट वाली बिट ऑन हो जाएगी और बाकी दोनों ऑफ हो जाएंगी। सिमिलरली सेकंड वाली फीमेल की थी तो ये फीमेल वाली बिट ऑन हो गई एंड बाकी बिट्स ऑफ हैं। सिमिलरली लाइक अदर के लिए ये अदर वाली बिट ऑन हो गई एंड द रेस्ट ऑफ द बिट्स आर ऑफ। So this is how one hot encoding works. Now can we interpret these small arrays at every index? अब इस तरह we're making sure that we're not telling the model that one thing has precedence over the other, and the model will interpret this as 3 different features, okay? So उसने एक फीचर मेल ले लिया, एक फीचर फीमेल ले लिया और एक फीचर जेंडर ले, सॉरी अदर ले लिया, एंड वी नो दैट इन तीनों में से कोई एक सिर्फ वन हो सकता है एट एन इंस्टेंस। So essentially, this is how you will encode the gender column. Alternatively, now I'm going to quickly go back and tell you कि if I remove other और सिर्फ मेल और फीमेल वैल्यूज रह जाएं जेंडर की, तो फिर इस encoding scheme की मुझे ज़रूरत नहीं रहेगी, because this is what I can do then. See, अब ये बस एक को 1 कर देगा, एक को 0 कर देगा, because now it's just binary. Now the model can interpret it this way, female versus not female. So ये भी one hot encoding ही होती है. You can interpret it that way, but this is binary one hot encoding. Either way, it's one hot. This is not exactly जो आपकी ordinal encoding है, because उस case में I could have had 1 2 or I could have had 10 20. So this is not the same thing. But ये जो 0 1 है, this is binary one hot encoding. Are there any questions at this point? I'm just going to change this seed and then let's see. All right. So अब मैंने gender column में ये 2 values डाल दिए. Now we know कि gender पे we're going to do binary one hot encoding. Moving on to education. Now we have 4 different kinds of educations available. Highest education है. You can either have high school or bachelor's or master's or PhD. So if I do one hot encoding, I will have 4 separate columns here, which also sounds fine. But should I do one hot encoding or can I do ordinal encoding over here?
I think ordinal encoding, which will correspond to the higher level of education having more significance.
Perfect. Yeah, precisely. So इसके लिए I would do ordinal encoding, because now I know कि order follow हो रहा है, और ये order जो है आपको खुद manually define करना पड़ता है. Like your model will not figure it out. Even if you leave it for it to figure out, तो वो गलत उसको encode कर सकता है, right? So for instance, मैंने एक dictionary define कर ली. This is what that looks like. Education के लिए. And उसमें I have PhD के corresponding जो value है, that is 4. That's the highest. And then master's के corresponding value can be 3, which is smaller than that. And then bachelor के corresponding value can be 2. And then high school के corresponding value can be 1. So you kind of have to define an encoding scheme yourself जब आपने ordinal encoding करनी हो. And then you feed that encoding scheme to the whatever function it is that you're using, और वो उसको use करके encode कर देता है. All right, similarly you have marital status. So what kind of encoding can we do for this one?
Uh, I think one hot maybe,
Yeah,
unless
and why?
because I don't think there's any per se like significance to whether you're gonna be married, single or divorced.
Yeah, precisely the answer that I was looking for. Exactly. So with that, now that we know कि हमने कहाँ पे कौन सी encoding करनी है, तो we can finally prepare our data. And I wanted to work this out before moving on to how you do this in code. First, you need to know what you do in code. So मैंने numbers वाले columns लिए और उनको तो मैंने simply standardize या normalize कर दिया. फिर let's see, yeah. So I'm starting with the education, all right? एंड इसको करने का बेहतर तरीका भी हो सकता था बट आई चोज टू डू इट द वे दैट वी आर फेमिलियर विद. सो आई डिफाइंड अ फंक्शन एजुकेशन ऑर्डर. उस फंक्शन को एक वैल्यू पास हो रही है. इफ वैल्यू इज हाई स्कूल इट रिटर्न 0. Actually, I want to start it with 1, 2, 3, and 4 like we decided, but ये भी ठीक है. This also doesn't matter. If it is bachelor's, it will return true. If it's master's, it will return 3. And else, may obviously, it's going to be PhD, so it returns 4. And then we're all very familiar with this pandas command now. df education dot apply और फिर आप apply के अंदर function का name pass कर देते हैं. And I use it to create a new column which I have called education encoded. And see ये इस column में PhD के corresponding first value पे 4 है for instance. Alternatively, इसको डिक्शनरी के थ्रू भी किया जा सकता था, like I was showing you guys. So that is what this would look like. उसको भी जल्दी से देख लेते हैं एक बार, because what's the harm?
Maybe it's a question, था.
Yeah.
Uh, when we're doing the ordinal encoding, how would we know what has more significance in respect to our data, or if something will ever have significance in respect to
Ah,
our
I get
models?
it. I absolutely get it. So इस चीज को हम कहते हैं domain knowledge, which is an implied branch of AI, ML वगैरह whatever. तो ये आपको खुद पता होना चाहिए what you're doing. Like for instance, मुझे मेडिकल का कोई आइडिया नहीं है और मैं ट्यूमर का स्टेटस प्रिडिक्ट कर रही हूँ. एंड आई हैव द डेटा सेट फ्रॉम एन एक्चुअल हॉस्पिटल जिसमें आई हैव थाउजेंड्स ऑफ रोज एंड हंड्रेड्स ऑफ फीचर्स. लाइक मेरे पास 120 फीचर्स हैं फॉर इंस्टेंस, जिसमें बहुत छोटे छोटे बायोमार्कर्स हैं, ब्लड प्रेशर रीडिंग्स हैं, ब्लड ग्लूकोज लेवल रीडिंग्स हैं एंड एवरीथिंग. और कई ऐसे प्रोटीन्स वगैरह हैं जिनके मुझे नाम भी नहीं आते, और कई ऐसी वैल्यूज हैं. तो आई एम नॉट गोना बी एबल टू डू एनीथिंग विद दैट डेटा एक्चुअली. It's just going to be a bunch of flukes. I'm going to randomly try a bunch of models, see if anything works, and that is what we call garbage in, garbage out. तो ये आपको थोड़ी डोमेन नॉलेज होनी चाहिए अपने प्रॉब्लम की. एज अ डेटा साइंटिस्ट यू शुड नो कि कौन से वेरिएबल्स का क्या मतलब है, किस चीज की क्या सिग्निफिकेंस है आपके लिए. कुछ आपको डोमेन नॉलेज होना चाहिए और कुछ आप डेटा एक्सप्लोर करके खुद देखते हैं when you make different kinds of plots and when you look at different correlation coefficients, etc. I hope that answers your question, or is there anything else?
No, that's it.
Okay, all right. So ये आपके पास मैंने डिक्शनरी डिफाइन कर ली है. आई एम ट्राइंग टू रिमेम्बर कि डिक्शनरी डिफाइन करने के बाद आप कौन सा यहाँ पे लगाते थे. df dot set maybe. नहीं, ये डेफिनेटली मैं भूल गई हूँ, सो आई विल जस्ट ऐड दिस लेटर. बट देयर इज डेफिनेटली एक फंक्शन जिसका नेम नहीं मुझे याद आ रहा. लेट्स ट्राई एंड गूगल इट. अप्लाइंग dictionary on a column for encoding. ये भी नहीं मुझे दे रहा. Anyway, we don't have time for this. So I'm just gonna move on from it. But I'm definitely gonna look into this though, बिकॉज ये भी एक इंटरेस्टिंग चीज है, मुझे ये कन्वेंशन इजियर लगती है कि व्हेन यू जस्ट हैव अ सिंपल डिक्शनरी डिफाइंड. ऑलराइट, एनीवे, now that we're done with that, next we're going to encode our. अच्छा, so एक हमारे पास ordinal variables थे, जिसमें ordinal में आपके पास ये एक example थी education की, जिनका order था. That's how you're gonna remember this. And then alternatively you have nominal variables, जिनकी nominal values हैं, कोई order नहीं है, जैसे कि marital status. Or alternatively you have um gender. Yeah, gender in this case. So is pe we're gonna do one hot encoding. That's what you do for nominal variables. I have one interesting thing over here, and I'm going to introduce this. It's not something that gets tested. I'm not sure if we've covered this in the course or not, but to help you understand why you're doing what you're doing. Anyway, so जो आपके पास encoding के लिए function है, वो pandas का function है, and it is pd dot get dummies. And get dummies gives you what, वो जो हमने different bits में distributed देखा था. So, like, if we quickly look at what this gave us, it will make a lot of sense. See, like I told you guys, कि वो underscore के आगे लगा देता है value. So, underscore married, underscore single. And if there were other values, तो वो भी इसके आगे append हो जाती. In this case, ये दो ही generate हुई हुई हैं. अगर तीन हुई होती तो ये भी आ जाता. And ये true false just means like 0 1 वाला ही case है. Acha, nahi, actually you had three values. Now I'm going to remove this and show you guys what is happening. Prefix मैंने अलग से specify किया है, that is not necessary at all. Even if you don't do it, you're good. So let's just look at this part of the function. See, pd.getDummies, और उसके अंदर आपने pass कर दी है वो वाली series जिस पे आपने one hot encoding करनी है. And this is what it gives me. So divorced, married and single. पहले prefix define किया हुआ था. I didn't know कि by default कोई prefix ही नहीं लग रहा. So that works fine for us either way. See, now the problem with this is that this introduces multi-collinearity. And very quickly, I'm going to tell you what multi-collinearity is. This means that आपके जो columns हैं, बल्कि I think this was briefly discussed in class as well. It means that your columns are linear combinations of each other. ऑल राइट, इट मीन्स कि कोई से दो कॉलम्स को यूज करके तीसरे कॉलम की वैल्यू आप प्रिडिक्ट कर सकते हैं. एंड वी ऑल नो व्हाई यू डोंट डू दैट बिफोर पासिंग योर डेटा टू ए मॉडल. सो वन हॉट encoding विल ऑलवेज रिजल्ट इन दिस, बिकॉज लेट मी टेल यू व्हाट, अगर आपको दो कॉलम्स की वैल्यू पता है, फॉर इंस्टेंस मैरिड एंड सिंगल फॉल्स है, तो यू नो दैट divorced must be true because one of the three columns has to be true. So column 1 will always equal 1 minus column 2 plus column 3. And this formula will always work जो मर्जी आप column की values रख लें. For instance, this column was divorced, column 2 was married, and column 3 was single. सो फॉर इंस्टेंस मैंने ये वैल्यूज रख ली. अब अगर मेरिट की वैल्यू फॉल्स है और सिंगल की वैल्यू भी फॉल्स है, तो 1 - 0 - 0 would give you 1. That's how these are a linear combination of each other. And essentially, now when I pass this particular parameter drop first equals true, तो इसमें से जो first वाला है divorced उसको ये drop कर देगा और बाकी दोनों रहने देगा. And of course we know that if we know the value of married and single, then obviously that tells us the value of divorced as well. But model को आप कोई ऐसे columns नहीं pass कर रहे any longer which are linear combinations of each other, and that is why you use this command. At the same time, it is ensuring कि data उसको सारा जा रहा है. You're giving it all the information that it needs. And that's how I got here. Are there any questions at this point?
So the model will infer on its own if someone is divorced or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Because मॉडल को तो आपने इंफॉर्मेशन देनी है ना. ये पहली वाली रो अगर हम देखें जिसमें ये दोनों फॉल्स हैं, तो मॉडल को ये फॉल्स और फॉल्स वाली चीज कम्युनिकेट कर देगी कि सम अदर वैल्यू इज ट्रू. एंड ऑब्वियसली मॉडल को ये नहीं पता कि मैरिड, डिवोर्स या सिंगल का क्या मतलब है. मॉडल तो मेरे नंबर्स को ही इंटरप्रेट कर रहा है, एंड नंबर्स में आई एम रिप्रेजेंटिंग दिस यूनिक इंफॉर्मेशन. I hope that answers your question.
Yes.
Okay, with that, let's move on. So हमने ऑर्डिनल encoding कर ली एंड हमने वन हॉट encoding कर ली एंड अब ये बाइनरी वन हॉट encoding है for gender which we're doing. So I'm just gonna specify one hot over here anyway because I need you guys to keep in mind कि ये भी one hot की ही scheme है. Because see, you're using the same function literally as well. pd.getDummies. एंड बाकी एग्जैक्टली वही चीजें पास हो रही हैं इनफैक्ट इसको ये ड्रॉप फर्स्ट ना भी पास करें तो आई बिलीव दैट्स फाइन नहीं करना पड़ेगा बिकॉज उसने दो क्रिएट कर दिए हैं कॉलम्स एंड ऑफ कोर्स देर बोथ कैन बी ए लिनियर कॉम्बिनेशन ऑफ द अदर अगर एक ट्रू है तो दूसरा फॉल्स ही होगा तो लेट्स ड्रॉप फर्स्ट सी जेंडर मेल सो मॉडल को ये पता चल रहा है कि आइदर द पर्सन इज मेल और द पर्सन इज नॉट मेल ऑलराइट सो अब हमने encoding पूरी कर लिया उसके बाद मैंने normalization किया because for my numerical columns I'm just gonna do standardization or normalization. All right, after that I'm combining all my features into a data frame because मेरा जो original data frame है it looks kind of like this right now. So there's stuff that I don't need in here like एजुकेशन इंकोडेड को मैंने ऑलरेडी लाइक एजुकेशन को मैंने एजुकेशन इंकोडेड में इंकोड कर दिया हुआ सो आई डोंट नीड दिस कॉलम एनी लॉन्गर सिमिलरली बाकी जो हैं कॉलम्स जेंडर वाले और मैरिटल स्टेटस वाले वो मैंने और जगहों पे स्टोर किए हुए हैं डीएफ मैरिटल डमीज डीएफ जेंडर डमीज and now ultimately I want to merge this into a single data frame so this is how I've done that pd.concat and we know कि ये जो concatenation वाली command है by default ये rows को ऊपर नीचे stack कर देती है if I specify axis equals 1 तो फिर ये columns को concatenate करेगी something that we've already covered एंड इसमें मैंने ओरिजिनल डेटा फ्रेम में से एज एंड एजुकेशन इंकोडेड दे दिया और फिर जेंडर के डमीज जो जनरेट हुए थे वो दे दिए मैरिटल स्टेटस के डमीज पास कर दिए एंड देन परचेज की वैल्यूज this is the final data frame that I have generated. And now we have prepared our data to be passed to our model. So ये बड़ा important process है. This is where we started from. This I couldn't have passed to my model. So the entire process of doing this was so important. Now I have my data in this format because eventually model को सिर्फ numbers चाहिए. Now everything is represented by a number somehow. ये जो true false है ये भी in actual zeros and ones ही हैं. Are there any questions up until this point?
No.
So I'm going to quickly give us a bird's eye view again of modeling the data. Step 1 was defining X and Y. Step 2 was preparing your data. Alternatively, 1 or 2 को आप switch भी कर सकते थे. I don't see the point though. Anyway, then step 3 now is splitting your data into training and testing sets. So अब like अगर मैं पहले split कर लेती तो मुझे यही काम train और test दोनों के लिए अलग-अलग करना पड़ता, which doesn't make sense. Alright? Anyway, so for splitting, what have I done? मैंने X लिया है and X में से मैंने ये purchased को drop कर दिया because obviously that's what I'm predicting. I don't want it in my features. And then Y में मैंने सिर्फ purchase को store कर लिया. Now I'm using the same split function and test size is 0.2 which means 20% data which is 100 out of 500 rows. Test में डाल दो and बाकी सब train में रख लो. Just to quickly see that it still gives us these data frames, right? सिर्फ जो X train है उसमें you will see कि कोई Y नहीं है, Y being the purchased column. Then step 4 is defining your model and everything is very simple at this point. Actually, you have logistic regression. We already imported this. Then step 5 is training the model for which we have our same command model.fit जिसको दो चीजें पास होती हैं X train and Y train. So like the features for training and the corresponding values of the target variable for training जिन्हें यूज करके वो लॉस कंप्यूट करके लॉस को प्रोपिगेट करता है. Okay, then step 6 may you make predictions on your test set for which the command is still the same model.predict and you only pass the features of the test set over here. You don't pass the ground truths. जो y predicted आपने obtain किया है उसकी हम शक्ल भी देख लेते हैं. This is what that looks like. So ये activation function लग के आते हैं zeros and ones. This is what the model has predicted. Now, of course, alternatively, if I see, I just want to show you guys one thing. सो ये y प्रिडिक्टेड है एंड अगर हम y टेस्ट देखें तो वो इस तरह था. तो इन दोनों वैल्यूज को कंपेयर करके इट कैन ऑब्वियसली कैलकुलेट द एक्यूरेसी, राइट? Accuracy would just mean the number of values predicted correctly divided by the total number of values multiplied by 100%. And so I have model.score which already calculates the accuracy for me. Usko x test और वाई टेस्ट पास किया है. नहीं, ये मैंने गड़बड़ किया. टेस्ट क्यों पास किया हुआ है? इसको आई बिलीव के प्रिडिक्टेड पास होता है. Oh no, my bad. This is not sklearn का function. This is, sorry, I mean this is not matrix वाला function. So इसमें टेस्ट ही पास होता है. ये function जो है बैक एंड पे दोबारा से predictions calculate करके फिर accuracy calculate कर रहा है, which is 96%. It's high. It's not shockingly high though, because our data was generated with such a particular sophisticated process कि ये तो होना ही था. This will not always be the case. All right. Are there any questions up until this point?
I wanted to ask
Yeah.
कि when we're doing one hot encoding, will it always be necessary कि हमें एक column को drop करना ही करना पड़ेगा?
Yes, you should do that.
And the column we drop will be random, or will it
It
be
doesn't
based on
matter
the?
because जिस तरह आप देखें मैंने जो आर्ग्यूमेंट स्पेसिफाई किया वो फर्स्ट वाला था. वो फर्स्ट कॉलम को ऑटोमेटिकली ड्रॉप कर देता था. And that worked pretty much all right for me, right? क्योंकि अब वो first column decide कैसे होता है, that's not at random. I'll tell you what, back end पे जब आपकी encoding हो रही है तो उसने gender वाले column को parse किया, all right. For instance, सबसे पहली value male की आई तो उसने by default male को पहला column set कर दिया. फिर next value other की आई, उसने other को second column set कर दिया. फिर जब मैंने ड्रॉप फर्स्ट किया तो उसने मेल वाला कॉलम खुद ही ड्रॉप कर दिया. मेक सेंस?
So we
टेक्निकली
just
इट
drop
डजंट
the
रियली
first
मैटर टू
column.
अस बिकॉज लाइक अगर मेरे पास सिर्फ मेल फीमेल होते फॉर इंस्टेंस और उसमें से मेल वाला कॉलम ड्रॉप हो जाता और फीमेल वाला कॉलम रह जाता तो माय मॉडल वुड हैव इंटरप्रेटेड इट दिस वे, ऑल राइट, आइदर फीमेल और नॉट फीमेल. अगर फीमेल वाला कॉलम ड्रॉप हो जाता और मेल वाला रह जाता तो माय मॉडल वुड हैव इंटरप्रेटेड इट दिस वे, ऑल राइट, आइदर मेल और नॉट मेल, either of which is passing it the same information, right?
Yes.
Is there anything else?
No.
Okay, so I have a bunch of other classification matrix which I wanted to show you guys real quick. At the same time, I would like to mention कि I don't think ये सारा कुछ class में अभी cover हुआ है. Inshallah, this will be covered in Wednesday's session. At the same time, I know that a lot of you are solving classification problems in your course projects. So you should know कि ये भी matrix होते हैं. All right. Everything is very simple though. For regression, for instance, जब आप numerical values predict कर रहे थे, you had your MSC, RMSC, and जो भी था, all of that. And इसमें classification में you have accuracy, precision, recall, F1 score, and everything tells you something different about the performance of the model. Accuracy is a very simple measure. वो तो मैं आपको बता सकती हूँ. It's the total number of values that it predicted correctly divided by the total number of values. So अगर 10 values थी और उसमें से 6 सही उसने predict कर ली, so the accuracy of the model is 60%. But accuracy is not always the best measure because I'll tell you what, if you were, I'm just gonna dial back to the same problem. If you were predicting whether a tumor is benign or if it's malignant, एंड सपोज आपके पास 10,000 पेशेंट्स का डेटा है और उन 10,000 पेशेंट्स में से 9,500 का ट्यूमर मिलिग्नेंट है, द ग्राउंड ट्रूथ इज मिलिग्नेंट, एंड बाकी 500 पेशेंट्स की ग्राउंड ट्रूथ इज बिनाइन, ऑल राइट. और मेरे मॉडल ने जो मुझे प्रिडिक्शंस दी उसमें मेरे मॉडल ने सपोज के 10,000 वैल्यूज में से 9,999 वैल्यूज को प्रिडिक्ट किया एज कैंसरस. तो मेरी accuracy would still be like 95% because 95% of the values were still predicted correctly. But then that doesn't really tell me how good my model is performing, right? It means कि मेरा model तो actually बस एक class की तरफ biased है. And this is why it's so important to look at other classification metrics as well. So अगर F1 score बहुत low होगा and accuracy बहुत high होगी, so I can interpret it this way that maybe there was class imbalance, and that means my model was biased towards one particular class. इससे ज़्यादा मैं matrix की detail में नहीं जाऊंगी since you guys still have to cover these. But everything that I imported from the sklearn library right over here, sklearn.matrix, I'm just using all of those functions now. So you have accuracy, precision, recall, and F1. इनके formulae भी we will study in class. And for this problem, all my values are pretty high actually. ये सारी values जो हैं, they range from 0 to 1, just like accuracy. Then you have the confusion matrix. This also I imported sklearn से. Now I'm printing the matrix. This is what it looks like. I have a more beautiful view of the confusion matrix, which you might have seen before, which you're going to be using more often. And that is why I used Seaborn as well. So I'm quickly going to tell you how to interpret this as well. So either you have predicted label on the x-axis, on the y-axis you have true label. Diagonal के ऊपर, the blue diagonal, you have all the values that were correctly predicted. So ये जो 44 है, 44 were the number of values जिनकी ground truth, the true label, was not purchased, and my model correctly predicted them as not purchased. Similarly, ये जो 52 का number है, it represents all the values for which the ground truth was purchased, and my model correctly predicted them as purchased. And ये जो 3 वाली value है, these are the 3 values for which the ground truth was not purchased, but my model misclassified them as purchased. इन्हें हम false positives कहते हैं कि इन्हें falsely as positive model ने identify कर लिया, in actual इनकी value positive नहीं थी. In this case मैंने positive class को purchased लिया हुआ है जो 1 से represent की हुई है. Anyway, and then like 1 over here represents all the values, the single value actually, जिसकी ground truth was purchased, but मेरे model ने उसको incorrectly classify किया as not purchased. So इन्हें हम false negatives कहते हैं, that your model falsely identified it as negative, even though in actual it was positive. And that's how you interpret a confusion matrix. Lastly, you have a classification report. सो इसके लिए भी आई इम्पोर्टेड द क्लासिफिकेशन रिपोर्ट. इसको वाई टेस्ट और वाई प्रिडिक्टेड पास होता है, और ये आपको वेटेड और माइक्रो और मैक्रो एवरेज और सिंपल एवरेज एंड ऑल, ये गिव्स यू ऑल ऑफ दैट. इट ऑल्सो टेल्स यू कि कितनी एग्जाम्पल्स थी हर क्लास की टेस्ट सेट में. सो 47 एग्जाम्पल्स 0 क्लास की विच वॉज नॉट परचेज्ड, एंड 53 एग्जाम्पल्स 1 क्लास की विच वॉज परचेज्ड. एंड देन हर क्लास के रिस्पेक्ट से उसने सारे मैट्रिक्स कैलकुलेट किए हैं. फिर उन्हीं मैट्रिक्स में क्लासमेट को उसने काउंट करके उनकी वेटेड एवरेजेस निकाली हैं. That's it for today. Are there any questions as far as these metrics are concerned?
No.
All right, great. So that will be all for today, and that will be the last tutorial of this semester. All right, halafis.